Well, good evening. I appreciate everyone being here this evening as we continue our study on our theme has been mountaintop experiences, drawing close to God, and how to draw close to God in intense circumstances. And so we've been on top of the mountain quite a bit so far. We're looking at stories from the Bible where mountains are involved. I know we began our first lesson when we just talked about the mountaintop experience, what it is to go up on a mountain, and how the Bible talks about the mountains. Zach was supposed to lead our lesson this evening. Zach's got sick kids, and him and Breeze had a kind of a rough 3 weeks. The kids have just been going back and forth, being sick. And so Zach asked if I could fill in, and I said, absolutely. So tonight, we're going to be going up to the Mountain of Transfiguration. Often, this is referred to traditionally as Mount Tabor, but also some historians believe it is Mount Hermon. So we don't know. Those are two different places or locations. We're going to go tonight with more of the tradition of Mount Tabor, with the understanding that we're not for sure. But we do know that Jesus went up on the mountain with 3 of his apostles of the inner circle. And so we're going to spend some time on that. If you remember when we began our study, we started at Mount Ararat with Noah, and then we went to Mount Moriah with Abraham and Isaac. From there we went to Mount Sinai and Moses, and then we went to Mount Nebo and Moses again, and then we went to Mount Gilboa when we studied about Saul and his sons, and then last week we went to Mount Carmel and talked about Elijah. It's interesting that we talked about Elijah last week because Elijah's actually in our narrative this evening. So we're going to talk a little bit about the Mount of Transfiguration. And what I want to do is just make some observations at the beginning, and then we'll make some applications toward the end. So when we look at Mount Tabor, traditionally from the 3rd and 4th century, the theologians of that time pointed to this mountain as the Mount of Transfiguration. This is a mountain that is 11 miles west of the Sea of Galilee. So we're in Galilee. So if you can picture in your mind Palestine, and you have Judah or Judea in the south, and then you have Samaria, and then you have Galilee. And of course, Jesus was a Galilean who was raised in Nazareth, even though he was born in Bethlehem, as was prophesied. So we know that Jesus spent a lot of time in Galilee. In fact, that a lot of his miracles and a lot of his teachings came around the area of the Sea of Galilee. And so from Mount Tabor, which we believe is where the Transfiguration was, you can see over the Jezreel Valley, which that goes back to even the time of Elijah. And, there's just a great view. There is a lot of vegetation on this particular mountain. And as you can see, it's kind of a round top. Today, there's roads that go all the way to the top. In fact, there's a church that's built up there called the Mount of Transfiguration Church, the big, nice church, along with a number of other monasteries. And if I ever make it to the Holy Land, these mountains we've been talking about, that will probably be on my bucket list, at least to go see some of these. The Synoptic Gospels all record this particular narrative about the Transfiguration. Matthew, Mark, and Luke. John does not, but it is interesting to note that in John chapter 1:14, John talks about seeing the glory of God. The glory of God was revealed, And you can't help but think that John, who was a witness here on the Mount of Transfiguration, that he may have been referring to that. Because what we're going to see is, in a sense, a revelation. I think it was Calvin who said an exhibition, in the sense that the God incarnate, seeing Jesus in the flesh daily and what people would see. And of course, Isaiah talks about that there was nothing about Jesus that you'd go, oh, this is God. Nothing about that. It wasn't like the Renaissance painters would have the halos around the saints. So that wasn't happening. There's a very good chance you couldn't pick Jesus out in some crowds, for sure. But yet, there were times in this particular instance where we see the glory of God manifested in Jesus. We see Jesus as a part of the Godhead. So we, in a sense, see a revelation. And this is something that they're never going to forget, even though that they are told not to talk about this yet. But we know they do later. I want to read a few verses. First of all, I want us to, I'm going to read from, you don't have to turn to this, but we'll come back to some of this here in a little bit. But to 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 16 through 18. Peter says, "For we did not follow cunningly devised fables when we were made known to you the power and the coming of the Lord Jesus Christ, but were eyewitnesses of His majesty. For He received from God the Father honor and glory when such a voice came to Him from the excellent glory, 'This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased.' And we heard this voice which came from heaven when we were with Him," and Peter then says, "on the holy mountain." So this was not just a legend. This was not just a story. This was confirmed by Peter, to the early church and to, of course, all of us today, that they had seen and they had heard the voice. And that kind of brings me to this evening as we study this particular passage of Scripture, that we do three things. We look, we listen, and then we learn. And Mark is really good at that, at painting pictures. Luke gets into detail quite often. And I'll be honest, I love studying Mark as well as I love studying Luke. Those are probably two of my favorite gospel writers to develop lessons from. But Mark, of course, is very descriptive. And that's one of the things, when you put the three synoptic gospels together, they all have little things that are a little bit different. For example, Luke points out that Jesus had taken His apostles to the mountain to do what? To pray. Okay? And we know that was no doubt a tradition with Jesus to go. He went into the wilderness. We find Him on the Mount of Olives. And it just so happens it was with these three that He goes on the Mount of Olives. So that was not uncommon for Jesus. Do you remember the time He went on the mountain and the disciples went and found Him and said, basically, what are you doing? Come on. And then another time they got in the boat and they went off in the Sea of Galilee because He went up into the mountains to pray. And then, of course, He met them on the water that evening. So this was not uncommon, and yet Jesus goes to, Luke says that they went to the mountain to pray. Well, this mountain is an incline. And as you can see, it's a rather steep incline. And you can just imagine, once again, when you talk about look, listen, and learn, imagine a drone flying over and watching these guys. It was probably of an evening when this was going on as they're making their way up the mountain. And that gets right back into the strength, if you will, of Jesus. I mean, Jesus, I'm teaching right now in the Civil War, and, we started out with Bull Run And we've talked about Antietam, and we've talked about, numerous battles: Shiloh, Franklin, Vicksburg, Pea Ridge, Prairie Grove, Chickamauga, all these, in the Sherman's March. And one of the things that when you read primary documents and you read like soldiers' letters, they talk about the march. They talk about how hard and challenging it is. And then when you read about how someone they would cover literally an infantry covering like 35 miles in a day, with all the gear and with all of the things and the logistics that they had to have with them, it's pretty incredible. So these guys were, by the end of the war, the ones that survived were pretty rough and tough, pretty healthy. One of the Confederate soldiers reading about, they mused, because they rarely had food, especially in Arkansas, they talked about the one thing that we've been told, that the skinnier we are, the less likely we're going to get hit, by a shot or something. So there was an advantage to not being well fed. The point is, there's not really a point there, I'm just kind of obliviating here, but the point is that they're walking, they're moving, and one of the things we see with Jesus is he's constantly moving. And we can imagine him going up the hill, and you can feel the breath, and you can imagine the beautiful sunset of the Jezreel Valley. And just like tonight, when there's, the colors just reflect and everything, this had to have been a great moment. They're away from the crowds. They're away from all the people warning, the shouts, and all these things. So this was a real important time that these apostles were having with their Lord, their rabbi. And we need those times. And I think that's, if the underlying thing in our study about the mountaintop experiences, we do need time for isolation. We need time to get closer. We need time to get away from the hustle and the bustle and the rings and all those things. Guess what? We need time away from our technology. I can tell you that for sure. And our lives would be so much better in many ways if we would learn to take time like that. So that's what Jesus is doing. So they're moving up. They're going up the mountain. I imagine they were breathing pretty hard to a certain extent, because when you're climbing an incline. Interesting thing, the other day I had Rhett, before he was sick, I had him and was walking up an incline of a mountaintop, and as I was walking, I was breathing pretty hard. So he began to imitate me toward the top of the hill, and as I was going, he started going, like that. So, he was just trying to, I guess, connect to me that, hey, if D is tired, then maybe I need to be tired. So you can imagine as they make their journey up there, here they are. So that gives us to the point that one of the writers, I believe it is Mark, if I'm not mistaken, talks about, no, it's Luke, that talks about that they fall to sleep. And this is not the first time these guys fall asleep. They had a tendency sometimes to fall asleep, sometimes not at the best times. Of course, we see that in the garden. It was Luke who said that. Another thing that we see is when the light appears, we're going to see that Matthew talks about the light. Mark describes it as a dazzling white bleach, and Luke says it was like lightning. So, let's read Mark chapter 9. So we're going to read Mark chapter 9, verse 2 through 9. Mark chapter 9, 2 through 9. Now after 6 days, Jesus took Peter, James, and John and led them up on the high mountain apart by themselves. And he was transfigured before them. And the word transfigured is a Greek word that in our language would mean metamorphosis. Okay? A change. His clothes became shining, exceedingly white like snow, such as no launderer on earth can whiten them. And Elijah appeared to them with Moses, and they were talking with Jesus. Then Peter answered and said to Jesus, Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. and let us make 3 tabernacles, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. Because he did not know what to say, for they were greatly afraid. And a cloud came and overshadowed them, and a voice came up out of the cloud, saying, "This is my beloved Son, hear him." Suddenly, when they had looked around, they saw no one anymore, but only Jesus with themselves. Now, as they came down from the mountain, he commanded them that they should tell no one the things they had seen till the Son of Man had risen from the grave. Now, once again, I want to make sure I bring in some of the facts from Matthew and Luke's account also. They didn't just, after the cloud left and the voice came, they were afraid. And of course, Mark points that out, and Jesus tells them, it's okay. All right, we're good. All right? In a sense, he does as he always does, he rescues them. He shows them some camaraderie, he shows them some love, he shows them some grace, if you will, because this was quite the intense experience. It was so intense that Peter, in a sense, was beside himself of trying to figure out what to do. Peter just, I guess, felt, and we've studied about Peter, he just felt compelled he had to do something. And, it's interesting, he says, it is good that we're here. And I've often wondered, what did he mean by that? It is good that we're here, even though he was in fear the whole time. So that's interesting when you consider that also. Now, when we talk about what happens here, as I said before, we need to look at what we're seeing. And all the writers kind of give us some kind of description. But the one thing that we will note, it is very difficult to describe. The glory of God, how do you describe that? Ask John, how do you describe heaven? Okay? It's not an easy thing. So we have Jesus who is concealed in the flesh, but God in the flesh. And we have this momentary time of the glory of God. And it is with light. It is with a light that is unbearable for the human eye in a lot of ways. One that will bring you to your knees. We know that God reveals himself to Moses at Mount Sinai in Exodus chapter 24. And then in 1 Kings, we know that God reveals himself at Mount Horeb to Elijah. Well, guess what? Who's here? Moses and Elijah. The lawgiver and the prophet. Okay? The giver of the message, the messengers of God. And so these two are in the presence here. And they're talking with Jesus. But we don't know what they're talking about, do we? No. What are they saying? Maybe one day when we get to heaven, we can maybe pull one of these apostles and say, hey, tell me a little bit about the Transfiguration Day. What were they talking about? How did you feel? What did you see? What was it like? Okay. This was nothing, there's nothing in their memory or in anything that they could ever conceive of something like this. Now, was it important? Absolutely. It's absolutely important that they understand what John affirms when he opens up John chapter 1, when he says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning, and then it goes on, and he says about the light that has come into the world. Obviously, understanding that as Paul talks about as Jesus incarnate, that we understand that Jesus, although in the flesh, okay, was God incarnate. And the glory of God, for a moment, for an instance, on this mountain is revealed. And I think it's very important for these apostles. I do not doubt the fact that the apostles looked at Jesus as the Messiah. I think the problem is how they interpreted who the Messiah was. It wasn't that they were non-believers and they were following Jesus all these places. And even, Peter affirms his belief that Jesus is the Son of God. It's not so much that. It's just that they still did not grasp what this new kingdom is. What's it going to look like? What is the glory of God in the kingdom going to bring about? And that's where their struggles was, because they were thinking in an earthly nature. So this, no doubt, was a compelling thing over time to increase their faith. Now we know they're going to fall not too long after this. Peter especially, we see him fall really soon after the transfiguration, and we're puzzled by that. Okay? And we often are puzzled by why we fall. When we know what we know. When we believe what we believe. When we worship, when we have those moments and we live that life as a Christian, and then all of a sudden we begin to regress, we begin to fall away, and we wonder what happened. So it's not uncommon for this to happen. Maybe we have lost our focus, which we have, on the glory of God. Everything becomes mundane and routine. Worship becomes routine, mundane. Living for Christ is just, is we say it and we project it, with what we say and maybe with some things that we feel like we're doing, but we're really not intimate with God here. You talk about intimacy, this is very intimate that they're here and they're around and they're being around the glory of God here on this mountain. And there's no doubt that this had an effect that would, over time, strengthen their faith. And so we have that on this mountain. We see the glory of God that is revealed. So I want us to consider that just for a few moments this evening, and let's consider some things that we might learn from this, because we realize that this is an intense circumstance. There is a thing that I want to kind of jump ahead just for a moment. And in the process of all this, we see Peter, once this is going on, he says, it's good that we're here. We don't know for sure if he knows what he's saying, but he says, let's build something. Let's do maybe we can build some tabernacles, let's do something. And this could refer, some commentaries will say this could refer to, because the Israelites were taught to build, the tents of the dwellings when they had their certain feast. And this is a part of celebration. This is a part of pointing toward God. So in a sense, Peter's saying it would be good on this mountain that we have one for Moses and Elijah, and we can celebrate this, and we can see the glory of God with all this, and then one for Christ. But notice what God does there. God does what sometimes when we read the Scriptures and we read about other people other than ourselves, He does something that we kind of want to say, like, hush, stop. Okay?